In 1726, the Electorate of Bavaria got a new ruler. After the long and tumultuous reign of Maximilian II Emanuel, power fell into the hands of his eldest surviving son, the 28-year-old Charles Albert. Although his father had tried to win the crowns of several of Europe's kingdoms and empires with ultimately no success, Charles would manage to fulfill one of the greatest of these ambitions. He would become the first Holy Roman Emperor of the House of Wittelsbach since 1347, and in so doing dethrone the Habsburgs from that title for the first time in centuries. Upon his birth in 1697, Charles Albert wasn't expected to succeed his father. He was the first of Maximilian's children through his second marriage to the Polish princess Teresa Kunigunda Sobieska. His older half-brother called Joseph Ferdinand was the Bavarian heir apparent, and starting the next year also heir to the Spanish Empire through his mother's family. Joseph's sudden death in 1699, however, ended the dreams of putting a Wittelsbach on the Spanish throne and made Charles Albert the new Bavarian heir. The War of the Spanish Succession, which broke out 2 years later, would make for a turbulent childhood. Despite being a Bavarian prince, Charles had been born in Brussels, from where his father ruled as governor of the Spanish Netherlands. In 1701, however, the royal family returned to Munich and stayed there for a few years until being split up due to the war. Maximilian's disastrous defeat at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704 had forced him to flee back to the Netherlands. Meanwhile, Teresa Sobieska was left to serve as regent of Austrian-occupied Bavaria, but after finding love letters of the Countess of Arco, a mistress of Maximilian Emanuel, she left to see her mother in Venice. As the Austrian army then refused to let her return, the children were left alone in Munich. In 1706, Charles Albert and 3 of his brothers were brought to the city of Klagenfurt on the instructions of Emperor Joseph I. There they began their education, primarily taught by Jesuits, and in 1712, after having moved to Graz, they were joined by a 4th brother. It wouldn't be until 1715, however, that the entire family was reunited. The war had ended shortly before, and the peace treaty handed back Bavaria to Maximilian, thus ending the Austrian occupation. But Charles didn't stay with his family for long. After reaching the age of 18 in August, he left for a year-long educational tour of Italy. Then, in 1717, he served among the Bavarian auxiliaries in the Austro-Turkish War. On his way there, he stayed for a while at the court in Vienna, taking the opportunity to get acquainted with the imperial family. After a second visit in 1718, Charles proposed to Maria Josepha, the eldest daughter of the now late Emperor Joseph. However, as she was already engaged at the time, she had to refuse, and Charles instead ended up marrying the younger of the emperor's 2 daughters, Maria Amalia. The wedding ceremony took place in 1722 in Vienna, although the majority of the festivities were held in Munich, lasting all the way from the 17th of October to the 4th of November. The two then settled down to live in Nymphenburg Palace and seem to have had a relatively happy relationship, sharing similar personalities and interests. Just like Charles Albert, Maria enjoyed court life, pomp and parties. She also had an interest in politics and a passion for hunting and travel. However, just like in the case of his father, Charles Albert had many mistresses, something which Maria Amalia would have to accept. When his father passed away in 1726, the time finally came for Charles to take over as ruler of Bavaria. But the electorate wasn't the only thing he inherited from Maximilian. He was also left with a massive debt of some 26 million guilders, a combined legacy of his father's extravagant court, grand building projects, and many costly wars. Charles therefore decided to slash court expenses, and together with a slight increase in tax income, the mountain of debt could begin to be reduced. In terms of a foreign policy, he maintained amicable relations with the Habsburgs, but also continued his father's policy of seeking the imperial throne for himself. This incentivized him to remain on good terms with the French as a potential ally against Austria. Already in 1725, he had established personal relations with the French court while attending the wedding of Louis XV, and during the War of the Polish Succession, which pitted France and Austria against each other, he decided to take a stance of neutrality. The death of Emperor Charles VI in 1740 would finally give him the chance to claim not only the imperial title, but also other lands held by the Habsburgs. This was possible because of his marriage to Maria Amalia. Since Charles and his brother Joseph had been the last male members of the Habsburg dynasty, they'd signed a pact back in 1703 granting succession rights to their daughters in the case of a complete extinction of the male line. The pact favored the daughters of Joseph, as he was the eldest, but shortly after coming to power, Charles decided to amend it, giving precedence to his own children in the so-called Pragmatic Sanction of 1713. He then spent years trying to get the decision accepted among the various courts of Europe and forbade the daughters of Joseph to marry without giving up their rights of succession. Accordingly, Maria Amalia had given up her rights when she married Charles Albert, and Maria Josepha gave up hers when marrying Frederick Augustus, the Elector of Saxony and King of Poland. Initially, this seemed to work. Through various negotiations and promises, most European powers came to recognize the emperor's daughter, Maria Theresa, as the rightful heir. But it didn't take long after his death for Charles Albert, along with the French, Prussians, and Saxons, to all break their promises and reject the Pragmatic Sanction. Thereby, the War of the Austrian Succession, which the emperor had tried to prevent, became a reality. Having entered an alliance with France and Spain and come to an agreement with the husband of Maria Josepha on how to divide the Habsburg lands, Charles Albert invaded Upper Austria in 1741. He soon took the title Archduke of Austria and set his sights on taking the city of Vienna. However, his allied French troops, led by the Duc de Belle-Île, redirected the campaign to Bohemia, leading to the capture of Prague in November that year. The next month, Charles was elected King of Bohemia, followed soon afterwards by the title King of the Romans, which actually means that he was King of Germany, not of Rome. Finally, in February the following year, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Frankfurt. The one conducting the ceremony was his own brother, Clemens August, who, despite normally siding with Maria Theresa's faction, had cast his vote for him. Another noteworthy supporter was the British King George II, who was eligible to vote through his position as Elector of Hanover and was actually allied with Austria in the ongoing war. Taking the name of Charles VII, Charles Albert now became the first Wittelsbach Emperor since the death of Louis IV in 1347. The tide of the war soon turned, however. The French had only ever lent their support to Charles half-heartedly, being more interested in splitting and weakening the Habsburg dominions than merely handing them over to a Wittelsbach ruler. Furthermore, effective cooperation between their armies was very limited. As a result, most of Charles's territories were overrun by the Austrians shortly after his coronation. Then, in December of 1742, most of Bohemia was lost when the Austrians allowed the French commanders, the Duc de Belle-Île and the Duc de Broglie, an honorable capitulation. With Munich falling under occupation, Charles would reside for almost 3 years in the Palais Barkhaus in Frankfurt. From there, he ruled as emperor, at this point a largely symbolic title, and tried to emphasize his government with various acts of law. Nonetheless, he soon became mocked as an emperor who neither controlled his own realm nor was in effective control of the empire at large. There's an old Latin saying which goes aut Caesar aut nihil, meaning either emperor or nothing. Referring to Charles, however, people would say et Caesar et nihil, both emperor and nothing. Furthermore, his general, Ignaz Felix, Count of Thüringen-Jettenbach, was compared to a drum, as people only ever heard of him when he was being beaten. His new commander, Friedrich Heinrich von Seckendorff, proved to be more competent. In 1743, his troops and their allies took Bavaria, and Charles was able to return to Munich for a time. Although it was lost once again, a Prussian campaign into Silesia the next year diverted the Austrian army away from Bavaria. Consequently, Munich was regained, and Charles VII could return to his capital. Just 3 months later, however, he passed away at Nymphenburg Palace. His death came as a surprise to outsiders, but he had suffered from severe gout. Charles's body was buried in the Theatine Church, while his heart was interred separately in the shrine of Our Lady of Alterting. One of his last acts as emperor had been to declare his son, Maximilian Joseph, to be of age. He could therefore succeed his father as Elector of Bavaria without the need for a regent. The reign of Charles Albert had marked the high point of Bavarian Rococo. He had completed the Nymphenburg Palace and erected the Grand Circle, or Schlossrondell, in connection to it. Flanked by a string of elaborate mansions, this was initially planned as the starting point for a new city called Karlstadt, but the project was never realized. In the old Munich residence, he created the ornate rooms, including the green gallery with walls covered in green silk damask and the mirror cabinet decorated with oriental porcelain. He also added the ancestral gallery containing more than 100 portraits of members of the Wittelsbach family. For his mistress, Countess Topora Morawiecka, he bought and renovated the Palais Portia in Munich, and for another mistress he built Holstein Palace, also located in the city. Finally, the hunting lodge of Amalienburg in the park surrounding Nymphenburg was built for him and his wife. Although outwardly simple, the building accommodates a series of elaborately decorated rooms, all with their own individual feel to them, while adhering to a greater whole. The richness of decoration culminates in the central hall of mirrors, the circular walls of which reflect the views from outside. Designed by François Cuvillier the Elder and executed by a number of local artists, it is one of the most exquisite works of Rococo architecture to be found anywhere in Europe.